Harlem in 1935 did not sleep, it endured. The streets did not rest, they listened. Brick buildings leaned toward one another like tired old men sharing secrets, and lamplight spilled across sidewalks worn smooth by generations who had walked. With their heads high even when the world demanded they lower them. Jazz drifted through open windows, sometimes joyful, sometimes aching, always honest. But beneath the music was something heavier, something unspoken. A pressure building like storm clouds no one dared name aloud. In those days. Dignity was not given, it was defended quietly daily, relentlessly. And on 138th Street, behind a modest storefront barbershop with gold lettering that read Johnson & Sons Grooming, a man named Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stood before a mirror, adjusting his tie with slow, deliberate care. He was not a tall man, not physically imposing. But there was a stillness about him that unsettled those who mistook silence for weakness. His eyes were sharp, observant, absorbing every detail of a room long before he spoke. He had learned early that loud men often lacked discipline, and discipline was the true currency of power. The barbershop was more than a business. It was a sanctuary. Men came in not just for haircuts but for dignity, for conversation that did not belittle them, for the simple human luxury of being addressed as sir. In a world that often reduced them to shadows, this small room restored shape to their presence. But that week, the air inside felt strained. Word had spread quickly. The Apollo Theater was hosting a major boxing exhibition featuring Harlem's rising hope, a young fighter named Caleb Monroe. Caleb had grown up 3 blocks from Bumpy's shop. His mother cleaned houses downtown. His father had passed years earlier, leaving behind only a watch and the memory of stubborn pride. Caleb fought not for fame, but for escape. And Harlem had poured its belief into him. The problem was not the fight, the problem was the contract. Promoter from downtown, Richard Halpern, had arrived with promises dressed in silk language. National exposure, bigger purses, travel, security. But buried beneath those promises were clauses that ensured Caleb would remain owned, financially, contractually, and strategically, by men who saw him as profit before person. Bumpy had read enough contracts in his time to recognize predatory ink. And tonight, Caleb was scheduled to sign. The shop door opened, and Caleb stepped in. He was 22. Broad-shouldered, nervous energy barely concealed beneath bravado. He tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You ready?" Bumpy asked calmly, not looking away from the mirror. Caleb shrugged. "This is the break." "Mr. Johnson, everybody says so. Everybody." Bumpy turned slowly. "Everybody don't fight in your corner when the lights go out." Caleb shifted. "You think it's a bad deal?" Bumpy walked toward him, steady and composed. He didn't rush answers, he never did. "I think," he said quietly, "that men who offer quick ladders usually control the roof." The words landed, not as fear, as warning. Caleb sat in the barber chair, staring at his reflection. "If I don't sign, they'll find someone else." Bumpy rested his hand on the back of the chair. "Let them." Caleb's jaw tightened. "You don't understand." Bumpy's eyes sharpened. "I understand more than you think." And he did. He understood humiliation. He understood exploitation disguised as opportunity. He understood that the world loved black talent, but only on terms that maintained control. The knock on the door came earlier than expected. Halpern entered, wearing confidence like a tailored suit. He smiled too easily, shook hands too firmly. His eyes calculated square footage and leverage in a single glance. "Mr. Johnson," Halpern said smoothly, as if greeting an equal, though his tone held quiet dismissal. "Heard you might be advising our young champion." "I listen," Bumpy replied evenly. Halpern laid the contract on the counter. The paper gleamed under the light. "Opportunity," in black ink. "I assure you," Halpern continued, This is standard, generous even. Caleb will be protected, guided. Guided where? Bumpy asked softly. Halpern's smile thinned. Toward greatness. The room fell silent. Bumpy didn't argue, didn't accuse. Instead, he walked toward the counter and gently slid the contract toward himself. He read slowly, every clause, every percentage, every in perpetuity and exclusive rights. His face remained composed. Caleb watched anxiously. Halpern tapped his watch. We're on schedule tonight. The press is expecting a statement. Ah. Public pressure. Another lever. Bumpy finished reading and closed the document carefully. Then he placed it back on the counter, not angrily, not dismissively, just decisively. This contract, he said calmly, makes him famous. But it keeps him owned. Halpern chuckled lightly. That's dramatic. No, Bumpy said, eyes steady. It's arithmetic. Caleb swallowed. Halpern's tone cooled. If he doesn't sign tonight, the offer changes. Bumpy nodded. Then let it change. The tension thickened. Outside, jazz floated faintly through the night air. But inside, the room felt compressed. Halpern looked directly at Caleb. You want to stay small, stay local? Or you want to be remembered? Caleb's hands trembled slightly. He looked between the two men, one promising ascension, the other offering caution. Bumpy stepped forward, his voice low but unwavering. Being remembered ain't worth losing yourself. The simplicity of it cut through the noise. Halpern's patience snapped subtly. You're interfering. I'm witnessing, Bumpy replied. There was no raised voice. No threat, only presence. Halpern gathered the papers stiffly. Midnight. That's the deadline. He left without shaking hands. The door closed. The shop felt smaller now. Caleb paced. You might have just cost me everything. Bumpy didn't respond immediately. He walked to the window and looked out at Harlem, children running, neighbors talking, resilience breathing. Then he turned. If your future can be taken away by refusing to sign a bad contract, he said quietly, then it was never secure to begin with. Caleb's eyes filled, not with weakness, but with conflict. You trust me? Bumpy asked, a long pause. Yes. Then we wait. The clock ticked toward midnight. Word began spreading quickly through Harlem. Caleb wasn't signing. The promoter was furious. Rumors exaggerated everything. Some said the fight would be canceled. Others claimed downtown investors were pulling out entirely. Fear is contagious, but so is courage. Around 11:40 p.m., something unexpected happened. 3 respected businessmen from within Harlem, a church deacon, a jazz club owner, and a local attorney, walked into the shop together. They had heard. They understood what was at stake. We can pool resources, the attorney said quietly. Form our own management group, the deacon nodded. Keep him here. Keep control local. Halpern had offered money. Harlem offered solidarity. Bumpy said nothing at first. He simply watched Caleb's face as realization dawned. The choice was no longer between fame and failure. It was between ownership and dignity. At 11:59 p.m., Halpern returned, irritation visible now. Well? He demanded. Caleb stood straighter than he had all night. I'm not signing, Halpern stared. You're making a mistake. Caleb's voice steadied. Maybe, but it'll be my mistake. Silence. Halpern looked at Bumpy. This isn't over. Bumpy's expression didn't shift. It rarely is. The promoter left again, this time without pretense. The shop exhaled collectively. But Bumpy did not celebrate. He knew something. Caleb didn't yet understand. Refusing exploitation often comes with consequences, and consequences were already gathering. Outside, police patrols moved slower past certain buildings. Whispers began downtown about uncooperative communities. Newspaper editors received subtle pressure. The next day's headlines were colder than expected. The exhibition fight was suddenly under review. Retaliation rarely announces itself loudly. It suffocates quietly. That night, after everyone left, Bumpy remained alone in the shop. He turned off the lights one by one, reflected on what had been set in motion. He had not threatened anyone. He had not raised his voice. He had simply refused to let a young man sign away his dignity. But powerful men do not like losing control. As he locked the door, he sensed it clearly, the beginning of something larger. Test. Not just of Caleb's resolve, not just of Harlem's unity, but of whether quiet strength could withstand systemic pressure. The wind moved down the street like a warning. Bumpy adjusted his coat and stepped into the night. The morning after, Caleb refused to sign. Harlem did not wake up the same. At first, nothing looked different. The fruit vendors still arranged oranges in perfect pyramids. The paper buys still shouted headlines with practiced urgency. The smell of fresh bread still drifted from Lenox Avenue. But beneath the rhythm of the neighborhood was something tight, like a piano wire pulled too far. Power does not like to be denied. And when power is embarrassed, it rarely forgives. By noon, the first signal arrived. The Apollo Theater announced a postponement of Caleb's exhibition fight due to logistical concerns. The explanation was vague. The timing was not. Word spread quickly. Some blamed poor ticket sales. Others whispered about insurance complications. But those who understood the machinery of control recognized the pattern immediately. Pressure. Not loud, not violent. Strategic. In the barbershop, men spoke in lower tones than usual. Bumpy stood behind his chair, razor gliding carefully across a client's jawline, steady as ever. His hands never trembled. His breathing never changed. But his eyes, reflected in the mirror, were calculating. Seems they're making an example. The jazz club owner muttered from the waiting bench. Bumpy dabbed warm cloth against the client's cheek. Before answering, "No," he said calmly. "They're testing." Testing what? How much we're willing to lose. The room fell quiet, because that was the real question now. Caleb had chosen dignity over control. But dignity, in this era, was rarely rewarded immediately. It was challenged, strained, provoked. That afternoon, Caleb arrived at the shop with less fire in his step. He held the newspaper folded under his arm. The postponement printed in black and white like a verdict. "They're freezing me out," he said. Bumpy finished trimming a customer's hair before responding. He removed the cape slowly, brushed stray strands from the man's shoulders, and thanked him with measured respect. Only when the door closed behind the customer did he turn fully toward Caleb. "They want you to feel alone," Bumpy said. Caleb laughed bitterly. "Well, it's working." Bumpy stepped closer. "Look outside." Caleb did. Harlem moved. Children played stickball on the sidewalk. Women carried groceries. A preacher stood on the corner speaking about perseverance. Life continued. Not untouched, but unbroken. "You ain't alone," Bumpy said quietly. "You're inconvenient." The distinction mattered, but inconvenience can become danger when powerful men feel challenged. That evening, 2 uniformed officers entered the shop. They were polite, smiling even. "We've had reports," one said, glancing around casually, "of unlicensed gatherings here after hours." The accusation was flimsy. The implication was not. Bumpy kept his tone even. "This is a barber shop." The officer ran a finger across the counter, inspecting dust that did not exist, just making sure everything stays orderly. Orderly. The word lingered like a warning. After they left, Caleb's jaw tightened. "They're trying to intimidate you." Bumpy picked up his ledger and continued writing as if nothing unusual had happened. They're trying to intimidate us. The next blow came from a different direction. The church deacon who had offered financial backing received a visit from city inspectors regarding building code violations. The jazz club owner suddenly found his liquor license under review. The local attorney's office was audited without notice. The message was clear. You do not build independent power without consequences. Fear began to seep into the cracks. Men who had stood confidently 2 nights earlier now hesitated. Phone calls went unanswered. Meetings were delayed. Caleb felt it. You told me we'd wait, he said one evening, frustration bleeding into his voice. But what if waiting is exactly what they want? What if this is how they break us? Bumpy looked at him for a long moment. Pressure reveals structure, he said calmly. If something collapses, it wasn't built strong enough. Caleb shook his head. You speak like we got time. I don't have time. And there it was. Youth believes urgency is survival. Experience understands that timing is power, but even Bumpy felt the tension tightening. 3 days later, the newspapers printed a damaging piece. It suggested Caleb had unreliable representation and hinted at possible connections to questionable figures in Harlem. The article never named Bumpy directly. It didn't need to. It painted a shadow and let imagination fill the rest. Caleb stormed into the shop with the paper crushed in his fist. They're trying to make me look dirty. Bumpy read the article silently. His face did not betray anger, but inside he recognized escalation. This was no longer just about a contract. It was about narrative. Control the narrative. Control perception. Control perception. Control opportunity. And now they were trying to isolate Caleb publicly so that any future promoter would see risk instead of talent. They want you desperate, Bumpy said softly. I am desperate. Caleb snapped. The words hung between them for the first time. Caleb's faith wavered visibly. Maybe I should have signed, he whispered. The admission hurt more than the postponement. Bumpy stepped closer, lowering his voice. Listen to me carefully, he said. There are moments in a man's life when the easy path looks wise, and later it becomes regret. And there are moments when the hard path looks foolish, and later it becomes legacy. Caleb looked up slowly. You chose legacy, Bumpy continued. But legacy don't show up overnight. The silence stretched outside. Thunder rolled faintly across the sky. That night, something unexpected happened. Harlem gathered. Word spread that Caleb would spar informally at a small gym on 145th Street. No promoters, no contracts, no press. Just community. What began as a quiet workout turned into a packed room. Men and women filled the space, cheering not for spectacle, but for solidarity. Bumpy stood against the wall, arms folded, watching. Caleb moved with renewed fire. Each punch carried frustration, yes, but also defiance. The crowd roared not because of technique, but because they recognized something deeper. Refusal to be owned, refusal to be silenced. And in that crowded gym, something shifted. Power depends on isolation. Community dissolves isolation. The following morning, a respected black-owned newspaper published a front-page editorial condemning exploitative contracts in professional boxing. It did not mention Halpern directly. It didn't need to. The piece reframed the story from uncooperative fighter to young athlete protecting his future. Narrative began to tilt. Downtown noticed, and they responded. Late that evening, a black car idled outside the barbershop after closing. 2 men remained inside, silhouettes behind tinted glass. They did not approach. They did not knock. They simply watched. Caleb saw them first. They're sending a message. Bumpy locked the door calmly. Yes, you're not worried? Bumpy turned the key slowly. Worry wastes energy. But even he understood the shift. The conflict had moved beyond contracts. It had become symbolic. If Harlem could successfully back its own talent without surrendering control, it would set a precedent. And precedent is dangerous to those who profit from imbalance. The next day, Halpern returned, not smiling this time. He entered the shop alone. "We can fix this," he said plainly. Bumpy gestured to a chair. "Sit." Halpern didn't. "You've made your point," he continued. "But this standoff helps no one. The fight can be reinstated." The article retracted. "At what cost?" Bumpy asked evenly. Halpern's eyes hardened. "Control must be centralized. That's how industries function." Bumpy nodded slowly. "That's how empires function." The air grew heavy. Halpern leaned closer. "You're playing a dangerous game." Bumpy's voice remained soft. "No, I'm correcting an unfair one." A long pause. Then Halpern said something revealing. "If this spreads, if other neighborhoods start thinking they can negotiate terms independently, it destabilizes everything." There it was. Not money. Not pride. Control. Bumpy saw the truth clearly now. This was not about Caleb alone. It was about precedent. He straightened slightly. "Then perhaps," Bumpy said calmly, "everything needs destabilizing." Halpern studied him. "You don't frighten easily, do you?" "No." Halpern gave a short, humorless laugh. "You think you're protecting him. But when this collapses, it'll collapse on him first." Bumpy met his gaze without blinking. "Then I'll be standing next to him." Silence filled the room again. But this time it carried something different. Recognition. Halpern realized intimidation would not work. He left without another word. That night, rain poured over Harlem in heavy sheets. Streetlights reflected off wet pavement like fractured stars. Inside the barber shop, Bumpy remained seated long after closing. He knew something decisive was coming. Power does not retreat quietly. It recalibrates. And somewhere in the darkness of downtown offices, men were deciding whether to escalate or negotiate. Caleb entered near midnight. "I don't know how long I can hold this," he admitted. Bumpy looked at him with something almost fatherly. "You're not holding it alone." "But what if they blacklist me entirely?" Bumpy stood slowly. "Then we build something they can't blacklist." Caleb frowned. "How?" Bumpy walked toward the door and opened it, letting the sound of rain and distant city life pour in. "By making this bigger than a fight." And in that moment, the strategy shifted. This was no longer about reinstating one exhibition match. It was about building leverage. The storm outside intensified, thunder cracking like distant artillery. Caleb stood beside Bumpy in the doorway, watching rain flood the street. "What happens next?" he asked. Bumpy adjusted his coat, stepping into the storm without hesitation. "Next," he said calmly, "we stop reacting." He turned back toward Caleb, rain soaking into his hat brim. "Eyes steady, and we make them respond." The wind howled down 138th Street, somewhere downtown. Phones began ringing. And for the first time since the contract was refused, the balance of power no longer felt one-sided. The cost of refusal had been heavy, but the cost of surrender would have been heavier. And the real confrontation was still ahead. The rain stopped the next morning, but Harlem did not feel washed clean. It felt watched. For 3 days after Halpern's last visit, nothing obvious happened. No new articles, no police inspections, no public threats. Silence fell like a blanket over the neighborhood, and that silence was more unsettling than confrontation. Because when men accustomed to dominance grow quiet, they are rarely retreating. They are deciding. Bumpy understood that better than most. He had seen empires rise and fall in whispers, not gunfire. He knew humiliation was something powerful men could tolerate, but exposure? Exposure was unforgivable. And Harlem had done something dangerous. It had demonstrated independence. The gym sparring session had not gone unnoticed. Photos had circulated. A local photographer captured an image of Caleb mid-swing, sweat suspended in the air like diamonds under cheap lights, while the crowd behind him stood shoulder to shoulder, faces fierce and proud. That image had spread through black-owned papers across the city. It reframed the narrative entirely. This was no longer a reckless young fighter defying opportunity. This was a community, standing behind its own, and that shift unsettled. Downtown. The first real escalation came on a Thursday afternoon. Caleb's mother, Mrs. Monroe, returned home from cleaning a townhouse on the Upper East Side to find her landlord waiting on the stoop. He was polite but uneasy. He handed her a letter stating that the building would be undergoing structural renovations and tenants were expected to vacate within 30 days. Mrs. Monroe had lived there 11 years. The timing was not coincidence. When Caleb learned of it, his fists clenched in a way that had nothing to do with boxing. "They're coming after my family now." Bumpy listened without interruption. His face did not change, but his eyes darkened slightly. There are lines in a struggle that remain strategic, and there are lines that become personal. This was personal, but anger is a weapon that often harms the one holding it. "Sit down," Bumpy said quietly. Caleb paced instead. "You told me they'd pressure us. You didn't say they'd target my mother." "I told you," Bumpy replied evenly. "Power tests commitment. This ain't a test. This is cruelty." Yes, the word was simple. It did not excuse. It acknowledged. Bumpy walked to the window of the shop, looking out at Harlem moving in its steady rhythm. Inside him something shifted. Not rage, but resolve hardening. "They crossed a line," Caleb said. Bumpy turned. "No," he corrected. Softly, they revealed it. Caleb's breathing slowed slightly, though fury still simmered. "What do we do?" And now, for the first time since the conflict began, Bumpy did not answer immediately, because this moment required precision. Retaliation would confirm every stereotype downtown wanted to assign. Violence would justify crackdown. Loud threats would isolate them further. No. This would require something sharper. That evening, Bumpy put on his coat and hat and walked downtown alone. He did not inform Caleb. He did not gather support. He did not posture. He walked into the marble lobby of Halpern's office building, as if he belonged there, because psychologically, he did. Confidence is not granted by architecture. The receptionist hesitated. "I don't have an appointment." "You don't need one," Bumpy replied calmly. His tone carried such quiet certainty that she picked up the phone without argument. Halpern received him reluctantly. The office was brighter than before, cleaner, sterile, designed to intimidate. With wealth rather than noise, Halpern remained seated when Bumpy entered. "You're persistent," Halpern said coolly. Bumpy closed the door behind him gently. "I came to clarify something." Halpern folded his hands. "Clarify what?" "The eviction notice." Halpern blinked once, too quickly. "I don't involve myself in housing." "No," Bumpy agreed softly. "You involve yourself in leverage." Silence. Halpern leaned back. "You're making assumptions." Bumpy stepped closer, not threatening, but present. "If this remains about contracts," he said, voice steady, "we can disagree like businessmen. If it becomes about families, it stops being business." Halpern's eyes sharpened. "Is that a threat?" "No." Bumpy's answer came without hesitation. "It's a boundary." The words settled heavily in the room. Halpern stood slowly now. "You're in no position to set boundaries here." Bumpy's gaze did not waver. "I don't need position. I need principle." The tension coiled tighter. "You think you're some moral crusader?" Halpern scoffed. "This is industry. You either align with it or you get crushed by it." Bumpy nodded slightly. "Then crush me," he said quietly. The simplicity stunned Halpern. "I'm not signing contracts. I'm not fighting exhibitions. I'm not chasing fame. If someone needs to be made an example of, make it me." Halpern studied him carefully now. "And what happens when I do?" Bumpy's voice remained level. Then Harlem stops cooperating. The words were calm. But they carried weight. Halpern narrowed his eyes. You overestimate your influence. Do I? Silence expanded between them, because Halpern had seen the gym. He had seen the editorials. He had seen the unified response. Harlem might not control Wall Street, but it controlled its loyalty. And loyalty, when activated, disrupts systems. You're bluffing, Halpern said finally. Bumpy reached into his coat, not for a weapon, but for a small folded document. He placed it on Halpern's desk. It was a draft agreement. Not from downtown. From Harlem. Signed by the deacon, the jazz club owner, the attorney, and several local investors. A community-backed management structure. Transparent percentages. Limited term. Shared oversight. Halpern scanned it quickly. You think this can compete with national syndicates? Bumpy met his eyes. It doesn't have to. A pause. It just has to survive. The shift was subtle, but real. Halpern had expected desperation. He found strategy. He had expected anger. He found composure. And most importantly, he realized something uncomfortable. Public perception had already begun to lean toward Harlem's position. If he escalated further, if the eviction story leaked, it could create sympathy he could not control. Control was everything to him. And for the first time, control felt uncertain. You're gambling, Halpern said quietly. Bumpy nodded once. So are you. The air felt electric. Neither man moved for several long seconds. Then Halpern spoke carefully. The eviction will be rescinded. Bumpy said nothing. But Halpern continued. The exhibition remained suspended until further notice. Bumpy considered this. Then he said something unexpected. Good. Halpern frowned. Delay builds attention, Bumpy explained calmly. By the time he steps into a ring, it won't be a fight. It'll be a statement. Halpern's jaw tightened. You're turning this into spectacle. No, Bumpy said. Softly, you did. And with that, he turned toward the door. Mr. Johnson, Halpern called out. Bumpy paused. You think you've won something here? Bumpy glanced back. No, he replied evenly. I think we've begun something. And that was the truth. The night Caleb Monroe won at the Apollo, Harlem did not explode in chaos. It stood taller. That was the difference. There were cheers, yes. Applause that shook plaster dust from the ceiling. Women dabbing tears from the corners of their eyes. Boys mimicking punches in the aisles. But beneath the celebration was something quieter and far more powerful. Recognition. Not of a fighter's strength, but of a community's spine. Because everyone in that theater understood something the newspapers would never fully capture. This was not just a win in the ring. It was proof that dignity could negotiate, that exploitation could be challenged, without surrendering morality, that power. When met calmly, sometimes bends, but Bumpy Johnson did not smile as loudly as the others. He stood near the back exit of the theater, hat low, coat collar turned slightly against the cool night air slipping through the doors. His eyes scanned the crowd not with suspicion, but with awareness. Victory, he knew, can intoxicate. And intoxication makes men careless. Harlem had gained leverage, but leverage must be handled with discipline. Caleb found him after the reporters cleared. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Caleb did something unexpected. He removed his gloves slowly and placed them in Bumpy's hands. I didn't win this alone, he said quietly. Bumpy looked at the gloves, then at the young man in front of him. Caleb's face was bruised, lips split, eyes slightly swollen, but there was clarity in his expression now. Not the anxious hunger of a man chasing escape, the grounded steadiness of a man who understood purpose. You won because you chose ownership, Bumpy replied softly. That was decided weeks ago. Caleb shook his head. You could have walked away when they came after my mother. Bumpy's voice remained calm. That's when it mattered most. They stood in silence for a moment longer, and then something shifted in Caleb's expression. What happens now? He asked Dot, and that question carried more weight than the fight itself, because now came the real test. Success invites new offers, and not all of them are fair. Within days, larger promoters approached, not with threats this time, but with admiration. They praised Caleb's discipline. They applauded Harlem's unity. They proposed partnerships on revised terms. Respect had replaced intimidation, but respect, Bumpy knew, can still conceal imbalance. He gathered the community investors in the church basement once more. The same room where doubt had once lingered now buzzed with possibility. But Bumpy raised his hand gently to quiet the room. Victory is not a license for arrogance, he said. The deacon nodded slowly. The jazz club owner leaned forward. So what's the move? Bumpy folded his hands on the table. We build structure. And this was the pivot no one downtown anticipated. Rather than chasing rapid expansion, Harlem formalized its cooperative model. Transparent contracts, legal counsel, profit sharing, education programs for young athletes about financial literacy, and rights. They did not simply defend one fighter, they created precedent. The news spread. Not dramatically, but steadily. Other neighborhoods began asking questions. Young athletes began reading contracts more carefully. Small community groups reached out for guidance. What had started as resistance became reform, and Halpern? He adapted. He had to. The backlash he feared never erupted violently. It matured intelligently. An intelligent resistance is harder to discredit. Publicly, he aligned with the new standards. Privately, he understood something fundamental had shifted. He met Bumpy one final time. Months later. Not in a tense office. But in a neutral cafe. I underestimated you, Halpern admitted. Bumpy stirred his coffee slowly. No, he said calmly. You underestimated Harlem. Halpern studied him carefully. You could have made this ugly, yes, but you didn't. Bumpy met his gaze evenly. Ugly is easy. There was no triumph in his tone. No gloating. Only truth. Halpern exhaled slowly. You changed the way we do business. Bumpy shook his head slightly. You changed it. We just forced you to see it. And that was the final lesson. Justice, when done right, does not humiliate. It corrects. But the emotional climax of this story did not happen in boardrooms. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning. Mrs. Monroe returned home from church and found her landlord waiting once again on the stoop. Her heart tightened. Until he handed her a new lease. Long term. Fair rate. Stability guaranteed. No renovation notices. No veiled threats. Just quiet acknowledgement. She stood on the steps holding the paper, hands trembling slightly. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from fear this time, but relief. Inside the building, neighbors peeked through curtains, already aware of what it meant. They had not been pushed out. They had not been divided. They had stood. That afternoon, Caleb visited his mother. He sat at the kitchen table where he had once done homework under dim light. The same cracked tile floor. The same worn cabinets. But something felt different. Ownership. Not of property. Of future. Mrs. Monroe touched his bruised cheek gently. You fought well, she whispered. He smiled faintly. I learned from watching. And though she never stood in the barbershop negotiations, she understood who he meant. Weeks later, as Harlem settled into a new rhythm, Bumpy reopened the barbershop. Fully. Business returned. Conversations grew lighter. But something intangible had changed in the room. Men sat straighter. Young boys listened more closely. The idea that exploitation was inevitable had cracked, not shattered, but cracked. And cracks are where light enters. One evening, as golden sunset filtered through the front window, Caleb entered quietly. He wasn't there for advice. He wasn't there for strategy. He was there for gratitude. He placed something on the counter. A Framed photograph. The image from the gym weeks earlier. Sweat in the air, community behind him. But in the background, slightly blurred, stood Bumpy. Watching. Steady. Caleb cleared his throat. For the shop. Bumpy looked at the photo for a long moment. Then he nodded once. He hung it near the mirror. Not front and center. But visible. Because the lesson was not about hero worship. It was about memory. That night, after closing, Bumpy stood alone in the quiet shop. He removed his hat slowly, looked at the reflection, staring back at him. He had not thrown a single punch. He had not signed a contract. He had not shouted in protest. And yet something lasting had been built. He turned off the lights one by one. Outside, Harlem glowed under street lamps. Not perfect, not free from struggle, but stronger. And as he stepped into the night air, a young boy across the street called out to him, "Mr. Johnson." Bumpy turned. The boy held up a pair of worn boxing gloves. "I'm training," he said proudly. Bumpy studied him for a moment. Then he walked over, crouched slightly to meet the boy's eyes, and adjusted the gloves gently. "Train your mind." "Two," he said softly. "That's where the real fights happen." The boy nodded with fierce determination, and Bumpy stood back up, tipping his hat slightly. Because legacy is not built in headlines. It is built in example. Years later, people would tell the story differently. Some would exaggerate tension. Others would minimize it. History often edits nuance, but those who were there remembered the truth. The night Harlem refused to bow was not loud. It was disciplined. It was not violent. It was deliberate. It did not destroy the system. It reshaped it, just enough. And in a world that often demanded surrender, a community had chosen something harder. Ownership. Dignity. Solidarity. In one calm, composed man in a barbershop had proven something powerful. You do not need to raise your voice to change the balance of power. You only need to refuse to lower your standards. The lights of Harlem flickered gently in the distance. The music drifted once more through open windows. And somewhere in the quiet hum of the neighborhood, you could feel it. Not pride. Not defiance. Something deeper. Respect. And that, more than any trophy, was the real victory.